The dust storm had been screaming across the plains of Verath 9 for 3 days straight, and the small figure huddled against the drainage pipe had stopped shivering 2 hours ago. That was a bad sign. Kale was a Tahari cub, barely 10 seasons old by his people's count, with matted gray fur and golden eyes that had seen far too much for someone so young. His mane, which should have been thick and proud like his father's, hung in dirty clumps around his thin neck. His claws, meant for hunting and climbing, were chipped and broken from digging through garbage. He had not eaten in 4 days. The settlement of Ashfall sat behind massive concrete walls about 200 meters from where he lay. The humans had built it 3 years ago when they came to mine the rare minerals buried deep beneath the red soil of Verath 9. It was not a large place, maybe 3,000 humans living and working inside, protected by a garrison of colonial soldiers who spent most of their time complaining about the heat and the dust and the food. Kale had been watching them for months, learning their patterns. He knew when the supply trucks came and when the guards changed shifts. He knew which dumpsters behind the mess hall had the best scraps, and which soldiers would throw rocks at him if they spotted him lurking near the walls. He had become very good at not being spotted. 6 months ago, Kale had a family. He had a mother whose singing voice could calm a storm, and a father whose mane was the color of dark copper, and 2 sisters who used to pin him down and tickle him until he howled. He had a clan of 47 Tohari living in a valley settlement on the other side of the mountains. Then the Adrathi came. The Adrathi were tall and scaled and cold in ways that had nothing to do with temperature. They moved through the galaxy like a slow disease, conquering and consuming and discarding whatever they did not find useful. They had destroyed Tohari homeworld a generation ago, and scattered the survivors across 100 frontier planets, like seeds thrown into dead soil. The raid on Kale's settlement lasted less than an hour. The Yudrathi did not come for resources or territory. They came because a Tohari elder had refused to bow, and the Dominion did not tolerate defiance. Their gunships turned the valley into glass and fire and silence. Kale survived because his mother shoved him into a cave and told him to run and not look back. He looked back. He wished every single day that he had not. Now he was here, alone on a world that did not want him, slowly dying against a drainage pipe, while the dust storm howled like something alive and hungry. The fever had started 2 days ago, burning through his small body like the fires that took his family. His vision swam and blurred, and the world tilted sideways in ways that made his stomach clench. He closed his eyes and thought about his mother's voice. He did not expect to open them again. The boot that nudged his ribs was not gentle, but it was not cruel either. It was the kind of nudge that said, "Hey, are you alive?" rather than, "Get out of my way." Kale's eyes snapped open, and he snarled, baring every tooth he had, which would have been impressive if he weighed more than a wet blanket. His claws came out on instinct, scraping uselessly against the concrete. The human standing over him did not flinch. She was a woman of medium height, with dark skin and short hair, and eyes that looked like they had been tired for a very long time. She wore the uniform of the colonial garrison, with a medic's patch on her shoulder, and she was holding a scanner in one hand and a canteen in the other. Sergeant Mara Voss looked down at the snarling, feverish, half-dead alien cub at her feet and said one word. "Nope." She said it the way someone says nope when they see a stray animal dying in the rain and decide that today is not the day they walk past it. She tucked the scanner away, crouched down, and before Kale could swipe at her again, she scooped him up in both arms like he weighed nothing at all. He did weigh almost nothing. That was part of the problem. Kale tried to bite her. She was wearing thick gloves. He tried to scratch her. She shifted her grip so his arms were pinned. He tried to scream, but his throat was too raw and dry to make anything louder than a rasp. Yeah, Mara said, walking back toward the settlement gate with the thrashing cub tucked against her chest. "You're very scary, kid. I'm terrified." The gate guard stared at her. "Voss, what the hell is that?" "Tohari cub, open the gate. You can't just bring a wild." "I said open the gate, Hendrix." Something in her voice made Hendrix open the gate. Inside the medical bay, Mara laid Kale on a cot and began working with the calm efficiency of someone who had treated 1,000 patients and stopped being surprised by anything a long time ago. She hooked up fluids, cleaned his wounds, injected him with a broad-spectrum antibiotic that she had to adjust for Tohari biology using a field manual she had downloaded 6 minutes ago. Kale fought her every step of the way. His claws left shallow scratches on her forearms that she did not even bother to bandage. She talked to him the whole time, not in his language, but in hers, a steady, low stream of words that meant nothing to him, but somehow helped anyway. "You're going to be fine, kid. You're tough, I can tell. You're mean as hell, and that's a survival trait if I ever saw one. Just hold still and let me—" "Okay, claws away. We talked about this." They had not talked about anything. He did not speak her language. She did not speak his. It did not seem to matter. When the fever broke 2 days later, Kale woke up in a clean bed for the first time in 6 months. There was food on a tray beside him, real food, not garbage, and a blanket that smelled like detergent instead of mud and rust. Mara was sitting in a chair across the room, reading something on a datapad. She looked up when he stirred. She did not rush over. She did not make any sudden moves. She just reached beside her chair, picked up a strip of dried meat, and held it out across the distance between them. Kale stared at her. In his experience, no one gave you something without wanting something back. The galaxy did not work that way. People were kind when they wanted labor or obedience or entertainment. Every hand that offered food had another hand behind its back holding a chain. He waited for the trick. Mara just sat there, arm extended, patient as stone. After a long time, Kale crept forward and snatched the meat from her fingers and retreated to the far corner of the bed to eat it, watching her the whole time with those huge golden eyes. Datapad. That was the beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, Kale did not leave. He told himself it was because the food was good and the bed was warm and the walls kept out the dust storms. He told himself he was using her, being smart, surviving the way a Tohari was supposed to survive. But every night, when Mara came back from her shift, exhausted and sore, and set out 2 plates instead of 1, without making a fuss about it, something inside his chest ached in a way that had nothing to do with his healing ribs. Then one evening he followed her outside and saw something that changed everything. A drunk mercenary, one of the freelance soldiers who drifted through frontier settlements like debris, had cornered 3 Tohari refugees near the supply depot. He was shouting at them, calling them animals, telling them to get on their knees. The refugees, 2 adults and a child, were frozen with the helpless terror of people who had learned that fighting back only made things worse. Things worse. Mara walked straight up to the mercenary and told him to back off. He hit her across the face hard enough to split her lip. She did not go down. She did not back off. She planted her feet and looked at him with those tired eyes and said, "Try that again." He did not try it again. Something about a woman half his size who had just taken his best shot and responded with absolute stillness made him decide he had somewhere else to be. Mara wiped the blood from her mouth, helped the refugees to their feet, and walked them to the aid station without once raising her voice. From the shadows behind the supply crates, Kale watched. And for the first time since the valley burned, the cub felt something stir inside him that was not grief or hunger or fear. It was something much more dangerous. It was hope. Kale stopped hiding after that night. He did not announce it or make a decision about it in any formal way. He simply stopped pretending that he was not following Mara everywhere she went. Before, he had kept to the shadows, watching her from behind crates and around corners, like a small gray ghost. Now he walked 3 steps behind her, out in the open, his golden eyes tracking every person who came near her. The soldiers at Ashfall noticed. "Voss, your dog is staring at me again," said Private Torres one morning in the mess hall. "He's not a dog," Mara said without looking up from her coffee. "And he probably doesn't like you." "That's fair. I don't like you either." Torres looked at Kale. Kale looked at Torres with the unblinking intensity of a predator deciding if something was food or furniture. Torres moved to a different table. Mara never told Kale to follow her, and she never told him to stop. She just adjusted her life to include him, the way water adjusts to every obstacle, adjusts to a stone in a stream, flowing around it naturally, without resistance. When she ate, 2 plates appeared. When she walked the perimeter on patrol, she shortened her stride just slightly so his legs could keep pace. When she sat in the medical bay doing paperwork, there was always a second chair. She did not make a performance of it. She did not tell people she was being kind. She just was. This confused Kale more than anything else in his life. Among the Tohari, bonds were loud and deliberate. You declared your loyalty. You fought for your place in the clan hierarchy. You proved your worth through action and strength and sacrifice. Everything was spoken. Everything was witnessed. Everything was a ceremony. Mara did none of that. She just set out 2 plates. Kale decided that humans were deeply strange creatures, but he stayed. The language came slowly at first. Mara started with simple words, pointing at things and saying their names in common. Patient with his pronunciation, which was difficult because Tohari mouths were shaped differently than human mouths, and certain sounds came out as growls, no matter how hard he tried. "Water," Mara said, holding up a glass. "Water," Kale repeated. "Close enough, chair." "Sure. That's a new word entirely, but sure." He learned faster than either of them expected. Within 2 weeks he could follow basic conversations. Within a month he could speak in rough, broken sentences that got his meaning across, even if the grammar made Mara wince. She taught him other things too. She showed him how to clean and bandage wounds, how to read the basic symbols on medical supplies, how to take a pulse on 6 different species. She explained these things not as lessons, but as conversations, sitting on the floor of the med bay, with supplies spread between them like toys. One afternoon she caught him staring at her sidearm. It sat in its holster on her belt, and his eyes kept drifting to it the way eyes drift toward fire. "You want to know about that," she said. It was not a question. He nodded, wary, expecting her to say no, the way every adult said no to every cub about every interesting thing. Instead, she unholstered the weapon, removed the power cell, checked it twice, and laid it on the table between them. "This is a standard colonial sidearm," she said. "It fires a concentrated energy pulse that can burn through light armor at close range. It can kill a person very easily. It is not a toy." She showed him how it worked, how to check if it was loaded, how to hold it safely, how to never point it at anything he did not intend to destroy. She did all of this with the same calm patience she used for everything. "Why?" Kale asked. "Why show?" "Because you're going to be around weapons, whether I like it or not," Mara said, "and I'd rather you understand them than fear them. Fear makes people do stupid things with guns." Kale thought about this, and decided it was the wisest thing anyone had ever said to him. The weeks turned, and life at Ashfall found a rhythm. Kale grew stronger on regular meals and proper rest. His fur regained its shine, and his mane began to thicken the way it should at his age. He was still small, still thin, but there was a wiry toughness in him now that had not been there before. He learned more about the humans. He learned that they laughed at things that were not funny, and cried at things that were not sad. He learned that they formed attachments to inanimate objects, and gave names to vehicles, and talked to plants. He learned that they could be petty, and cruel and selfish, and then turn around and risk their lives for a complete stranger without hesitating. They made absolutely no sense, and he was fascinated by every single one of them. But mostly he watched Mara. She was good at her job. The other soldiers respected her, even the ones who fought. Bringing a Tohari cub inside the walls was reckless. She worked long hours and never complained. She was gentle with her patients and firm with anyone who tried to skip treatment. She had a dry sense of humor that made people smile, even when things were bad. But there was a weight in her that Kale could feel, the way his people felt changes in weather. A heaviness that lived behind her eyes and came out at night when she thought no one was watching. He found her once sitting alone in the dark of the medbay, holding a small holographic image in her hands. The image showed a little girl with dark skin and bright eyes and a smile that could light up a room. Mara was not crying. Her face was completely still, which was somehow worse than tears. Kale did not ask. He knew what that kind of stillness meant. He had felt it himself, staring at the burning valley, watching everything he loved turn to ash. He just sat down beside her, close enough that his shoulder touched hers, and stayed there until she put the image away. She never explained, and he never asked. Some griefs were too big for words in any language. The military briefings worried him. Kale's hearing was far sharper than humans realized. He could hear conversations through walls that they thought were soundproof. He could pick up radio chatter from across the compound and distinguish individual voices in a crowded room. So when the garrison commanders started talking about Yadrathi fleet movements in the sector, Kale heard every word. Scout ships had been detected on the edge of the system. A full battle group was massing 3 jumps away. The Colonial Command was debating whether to reinforce Ashfall or evacuate it. The garrison had 200 soldiers and enough supplies for maybe a month. The Yadrathi battle group had 10,000 troops and enough firepower to crack a planet. Kale knew what the Yadrathi did to places they attacked. He knew it in his bones, in his scars, in the empty space where his family used to be. The thought of them coming here, to this place, where he had found warmth and food, and something that felt almost like safety, made his blood run cold and hot at the same time. One evening after dinner, he sat across from Mara and struggled with a question that had been building inside him for weeks. "Mara," he said carefully, "what is clan for humans?" She looked at him with those tired, knowing eyes, and he could see her thinking about it, really thinking, not just giving him a quick answer to make him go away. "Clan," she said slowly, "for us it is the people you choose, the people you would die for, even if they are not your blood. It is not about what you are born into, it is about what you build." Kale let the words sink into him. They were different from the Tahari way, where clan was everything, where you were born into your bonds, and they defined you from your first breath to your last. Choose your clan. That loyalty was something you built with your hands, rather than something you inherited, was strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Because if you chose your clan, that meant you could lose it by choice too. And it meant that claiming someone as clan was not an accident of birth, but an act of courage. He sat very still for a long time. Then he leaned forward and pressed his forehead against her shoulder. Mara went rigid. He felt every muscle in her body lock up, because she knew what this was. She had read about Tohari customs in that field manual she downloaded months ago. She knew that this gesture, the pressing of one's head to another's body, was the deepest bond a Tohari could offer. It was the clan bond, the joining of spirits, the declaration that said, "You are mine, and I am yours, and nothing in this galaxy can break what we are to each other." It was not given lightly. It was not given often. Among the Tohari, it was witnessed by elders and celebrated with songs that lasted 3 days. Kale had no elders. He had no songs. He had nothing but a scarred body and a mending heart, and the absolute unshakable certainty that this tired human woman with sad eyes and gentle hands was the most important person in his universe. Mara sat frozen for 5 heartbeats. Then, slowly, carefully, as if handling something infinitely fragile, she raised her hand and placed it on the back of his mane. She did not grip or pull, she just rested it there, warm and steady. Kale closed his eyes. "Then you are my clan now," he whispered in Tohari, and the words came out rough and breaking and perfect. Mara did not understand the language, but she understood the meaning. Her hand tightened just slightly in his mane, and she let out a breath that sounded like it had been trapped inside her chest for years. Outside, the stars turned over Ashfall, and somewhere in the dark between them, the Idravi fleet moved closer. But in that small room, in that single moment, 2 broken creatures held onto each other and became something whole. The sky above Ashfall turned the color of a bruise on a Tuesday morning, and it never went back. Kale smelled them before the sensors detected them. His nose caught the ozone tang of Idrathi drive exhaust on the upper wind, faint and sharp like burnt metal, and his fur stood on end from his neck to the tip of his tail. He was standing on the eastern wall doing nothing in particular when the scent hit him, and every muscle in his body went tight as a wire. He ran. He found Mara in the medbay, restocking trauma kits with the mechanical focus of someone who had done this before, and knew what it meant. She looked up when he burst through the door, chest heaving, eyes wide. "They come," he said in common, and the words were steady, even though his hands were shaking. "Idrathi, in the sky, now." Mara studied his face for 2 seconds. Then she hit the emergency comm on the wall. 40 minutes later, the garrison confirmed what Kale already knew. A Idrathi pacification fleet had dropped out of jump space at the edge of the system. Not scouts, not a raiding party, a full invasion force. Warships and troop carriers and gunships. Enough metal and malice to swallow Ashfall whole and still be hungry. Colonel Reeves, the garrison commander, was a tall man with gray hair and the look of someone who had been expecting bad news his entire career. He stood in the command center and laid out the situation with the blunt honesty of a man who had no time left for gentle words. "Orbital support is gone," he said. "The relay station was hit first. Our distress signal may or may not have gotten through before they took it out. Evacuation transports are not coming. The 2 that tried to launch were shot down before they cleared atmosphere. We are on our own." The room was silent. "We have 212 combat-ready personnel," Reeves continued. "Enough ammunition for maybe 5 days of sustained fighting, if we are careful. Against infantry, but they have armor and air support. We do not." He paused and looked around the room at the faces of soldiers who understood exactly what he was not saying. "We hold," he said. "We hold as long as we can, and we make them pay for every meter." The first bombardment began that night. Kale had heard explosions before. He had heard them 6 months ago, when his world ended, when the valley turned to fire and glass, and his mother's voice was the last thing he heard before the screaming started. He thought he was prepared. He thought the memory had hardened him, the way fire hardens clay. He was wrong. The Idrathi gunships came in low and fast, dropping plasma charges that turned the ground into craters of molten rock. The walls shook, and dust rained from the ceiling, and the lights flickered, and somewhere a water main burst and sent a flood of brown water rushing down the corridor, outside the medbay. Kale was under a table, with his hands over his head. Ears and his teeth clenched so hard, his jaw ached. The sound was inside him, rattling his bones, and the smell was the same, exactly the same as the valley. And for a terrible moment, he was not in Ashfall at all, but back in that cave, watching orange light eat the sky. Then Mara was there. She crawled under the table with him, and she did not tell him it would be okay, and she did not tell him to be brave. She just pressed her back against his, and sat there, solid and warm and real, and the weight of her kept him anchored to the present. The bombardment lasted 4 hours. When it stopped, the silence was almost worse. Mara stood up, dusted herself off, and went to work. The wounded started coming in before the dust settled, and they did not stop. A soldier with burns across half his face, a technician who had been near the water main when it burst and was half drowned and hypothermic. 2 civilians, a married couple who ran the settlement's only bar, both hit by shrapnel. Mara moved through the chaos like water through rocks, calm and efficient and tireless. She stitched and bandaged and injected, and spoke in that low, steady voice that made people believe they were going to live, even when the math said otherwise. Cale tried to help. He fetched supplies and held lights, and did everything she had taught him in those quiet afternoons in the medbay that felt like they belonged to a different lifetime. His hands were still shaking, but they were steady enough to hold a bandage roll, and that was enough. "Stay in the bunker," Mara told him when she was called to the forward triage station near the southern wall. No. She stopped and looked at him, and her face did something complicated. She was afraid, he realized. Not afraid of the Yadrathi, but afraid for him. Afraid that this place she had tried to make safe for him was about to become another valley. "Cale, I need you to be safe." "No," he said again. Bared his teeth, not in anger, but in fear. The raw, desperate fear of a cub who had already lost everything once, and could not, would not, survive losing it again. "You go, I go. Where clan goes, I go." She opened her mouth to argue, then she closed it. She knelt down so her eyes were level with his, and she took his face in both hands, her palms warm against his fur. "I am coming back," she said. "I promise." He wanted to believe her. His mother had said something similar, right before she pushed him into the cave. Mara saw it in his eyes. She saw the doubt and the memory and the terror, and she did not look away. "I am not her," Mara said quietly, "but I am making you the same promise, and I am going to keep it. Do you hear me?" He nodded, because his throat was too tight to speak. She kissed the top of his head, which was a human thing that he did not fully understand, but that made his chest ache in a way that was not entirely painful. And then she was gone. The siege lasted 6 days. 6 days of bombardment and sniping and probing attacks against the walls. 6 days of dwindling food and ammunition and sleep. 6 days of the wounded coming in faster than Mara could treat them. Cale made himself useful in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. His ears could pick up sounds that human equipment missed entirely. On the second night, he heard a rhythmic grinding beneath the eastern wall, low and steady, the kind of sound that rock makes when something is cutting through it from below. He ran to the nearest officer and tugged on the man's sleeve until he listened. "Under," Cale said, pointing at the ground. "They dig, under the wall." The officer looked skeptical. A junior technician ran a seismic scan and went pale. The Yadrathi had a tunneling unit boring through the bedrock directly beneath the eastern barracks. If it had reached the surface unchallenged, it would have put enemy soldiers inside the walls. While the garrison was focused on the exterior defense, they collapsed the tunnel with demolition charges. 30 Yadrathi sappers were buried alive. Cale did not feel sorry for them. After that, the soldiers stopped treating him like Mara's pet. They started treating him like a scout. They gave him a comm unit and posted him on the walls during the night shifts when his eyes and ears were sharpest. They called him Kid and Little Wolf, and occasionally, "Holy hell, how did you hear that?" Corporal Deng, a thin, quiet sniper from the colony of New Shanghai, took a particular interest in Cale. He showed the cub how to read terrain and identify enemy positions and estimate distances. He did not talk much, but when he did, his words were precise and useful, which Cale appreciated. You have good instincts, Deng told him on the fourth night as they crouched together on the northern wall, watching the dark plains for movement. But instincts will get you killed if you do not think. 2. Feel everything. Think before you act. On the sixth day, the Idrathi brought up their heavy armor. The southern wall took 3 direct hits from siege cannons, and the third one punched through. A section 20 meters wide collapsed inward in a roar of concrete and dust and twisted metal. And through the gap poured Idrathi shock troops, tall and scaled and armed with plasma rifles that glowed like captured stars. The garrison scrambled to respond. The fighting at the breach was immediate and savage, close-quarters combat in the dust and rubble, where technology mattered less than raw determination. Humans and Idrathi killing each other at arm's length. Mara was at the forward triage station, the one closest to the southern wall. Because of course she was. She was always where the wounded were, and the wounded were always where the fighting was worst. The secondary explosion came from a ruptured fuel line beneath the triage station. Blast flipped 2 tables, shattered every piece of glass in the room, and brought a section of the ceiling down in a cascade of broken concrete. Kale was 200 meters away on the eastern wall when he heard it. Not the explosion itself, but the sound that came after, the specific frequency of Mara's voice crying out in pain. A sound he could have identified across an ocean of noise, because his ears had been tuned to her voice for months. He turned and saw the dust cloud rising from the triage station. He saw the rubble. He saw Mara's arms sticking out from under a slab of concrete, moving weakly. And he saw the Idrathi kill team moving toward her position. 4 soldiers in heavy armor, weapons up, sweeping through the chaos with the cold efficiency of predators who knew that wounded prey was the easiest prey. Kale's heart stopped. Then it started again, harder and faster than it had ever beaten in his life. His mane rose from the base of his skull to the middle of his back, each hair standing rigid, making him look twice his actual size. His claws extended fully for the first time since the drainage pipe, long and curved and black as volcanic glass. His lips pulled back from his teeth, and a sound came out of his chest that was not a growl and not a scream, but something older than both, something that came from a place in his blood that remembered what his species used to be before the Idrathi broke them. He remembered what Deng told him. Feel everything. Think before you act. He felt everything. Then he stopped thinking entirely, and he ran. He covered the 200 meters in 11 seconds. Later, when the garrison engineers reviewed the security footage, they would play that clip over and over, and argue about whether it was physically possible. A Tohari cub, barely half-grown, moving across open ground faster than anything his size had any right to move, dodging debris and leaping over rubble with a fluid animal grace that turned the broken battlefield into a footpath. Kale did not think about speed or distance or tactics. He did not think about anything at all. His body was running on something deeper than thought, something written into the oldest parts of his brain, the parts that remembered a time before the Idrathi, before the scattering, before the shame. The Tohari had not always been refugees. 1,000 years ago, before the stars opened up, and the galaxy came pouring in with its politics and its cruelty, the Tohari were the undisputed apex predators of Tohar Prime. Nightmare of volcanic storms and acid rain and megafauna that could crush a shuttle flat. And the Tohari had not just survived it, they had ruled it. They hunted in packs across fields of black glass and brought down creatures 10 times their size, with nothing but claws and coordination and a fury that burned like the planet's molten core. The Idrathi had not beaten them with strength. The Idrathi had beaten them with ships and bombs and orbital fire, killing from a safe distance, because they absolutely knew, that on the ground, face to face, claw to scale, the Tohari were something that even the Dominion feared. The galaxy had forgotten this. Kale had never known it, but his blood remembered. The first Yggdrathi soldier never saw him coming. Kale hit the trooper from the side at full sprint. All 4 sets of claws extended, and his momentum carried them both into the rubble in a tangle of limbs and fury. The Yggdrathi was twice his size and armored, from neck to ankle. But the armor had seams and joints, and the neck seal was the weakest point, a fact that Kale did not know consciously, but that his claws found anyway with the unerring precision of a born predator. His claws punched through the seal, and the trooper stopped moving. Kale did not pause. He was already spinning toward the second soldier, a snarl ripping from his throat that sounded like tearing metal. The Yggdrathi swung a rifle toward him, and Kale ducked under it with a flexibility that human spines could not match, and raked his claws across the back of the soldier's knee, where the armor was thinnest. The trooper went down screaming. The third soldier fired. A plasma bolt grazed Kale's left side, searing a line of agony across his ribs that nearly dropped him. He stumbled, caught himself on a piece of rubble, and kept moving. Pain was just information, and information could be ignored. He leaped onto the third soldier's back, locked his claws into the hole, shoulder plates, and bit down on the exposed section between the helmet and the collar. His teeth were not as long as his claws, but they were sharp enough and placed well enough to find the gap. 3 down in less than 15 seconds. The fourth soldier was the officer. The Yggdrathi officer was taller than the others, and carried a ceremonial blade alongside his plasma pistol. He had watched the cub tear through his squad with an expression that started as surprise and ended as something very close to recognition. He knew what a Tohari was supposed to be. He had been briefed. He had been told that the Tohari were broken, scattered, tame. He was beginning to suspect the briefing was wrong. Kale stood between the officer and Mara. His fur was matted with blood, some of it his own, some of it not. His ribs screamed where the plasma had scored them, and his shoulder ached where a blade had caught him during the second fight, a wound he did not even remember receiving. Breath came in ragged gasps, and his legs trembled with the effort of staying upright. But he did not move. He planted himself over Mara's body like a living wall, teeth bared, claws out, golden eyes blazing with something that was not anger and not madness, but pure, undiluted refusal. The Yggdrathi officer leveled his pistol at the cub and spoke in the trade language that most species understood. "Stand aside, little animal. Your kind lost this fight a generation ago. You are nothing, a conquered people, a broken species. Step away from the human, and I will make your death quick." Kale heard the words. He understood them. He understood the contempt behind them, the casual dismissal of everything his people had been, and everything they had suffered. He understood that this scaled monster with his blade and his gun and his empire believed, truly believed, that the Tohari were finished, that their fire had gone out, that the last embers had been ground into ash under the surface. Dominion's boot, and Kale, 10 seasons old, orphaned, scarred, half dead on his feet, bleeding from 3 different wounds, standing over the body of the only person in the galaxy who had ever set out 2 plates for him. Kale looked at this officer of the empire that had murdered his family and burned his world and scattered his people across the stars like dust. And he laughed. It was not a human laugh, and it was not a Tohari laugh. It was something else entirely, a sound that came from a place beyond species and language, a place where pain and love and defiance all melted together into something unbreakable. 200 meters away on the northern wall, Corporal Deng heard the sound through his scope's audio pickup and felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. In the rubble of the southern breach, garrison soldiers who were falling back heard it and slowed. In the medbay, a wounded private lifted his head, rattled through his broken ribs, and he pulled himself up to his full height, which was not very tall at all. And he opened his mouth, and he screamed in common, so that every human, every Yggdrathi, Every living soul in Ashfall could hear him. Not a single hair will drop from the human's head anymore. And he leaped. The Adrathi officer fired. His shot went wide because he had not expected the cub to charge, and because some part of his lizard brain, the old part, the part that remembered what Tohari used to be, flinched. Kale hit him like a thunderbolt. They went down together, the cub and the officer, and what followed was not a fight in any tactical sense. It was a mauling. The officer was bigger and stronger, and armed, but Kale was inside his guard, too close for the pistol, too fast for the blade, a whirlwind of claws and teeth and absolute berserker fury. The blade caught Kale across the back, a shallow cut, but it bled freely. Kale did not notice. Somewhere beyond pain, beyond fear, beyond everything except the single burning imperative that had consumed his entire being. Nothing touches her. Nothing, nothing, nothing. On the northern wall, Corporal Deng made a decision. He adjusted his scope, steadied his breathing, and began putting rounds into every Yadrathi soldier within 200 meters of the cub's position. "All units," Deng said into his comm, his voice flat and calm in the way that only snipers and surgeons manage. "The kid's holding the breach. Someone want to help him out, or are we just going to watch?" For a moment, nothing happened. Then Private Torres, who did not even like the cub, stood up from behind his cover and started running toward the breach. His weapon was up, and he was screaming something incoherent. And behind him 2 more soldiers rose, and then 5 more, and then a dozen. They had been falling back. They had been beaten. They had been ready to accept that the southern wall was lost and retreat to the inner compound, and wait for the end. Then they saw him, a cub, a child, a refugee orphan who had nothing, who was nobody, who should have been hiding in a bunker, standing over a wounded woman, and fighting an empire with his bare claws, and something in them caught fire. The human counterattack hit the Yadrathi breach force like a hammer. Soldiers poured in from 3 directions, firing and shouting and fighting with a ferocity that the tactical manuals would later describe as disproportionate to the strategic situation, which was a polite military way of saying they went absolutely berserk. Deng's rifle cracked, steady and methodical, each shot finding its mark. Torres and his squad hit the left flank. A heavy weapons team set up on the rubble and raked the breach with suppressive fire that turned the gap into a kill zone. The Yadrathi fought back. They were disciplined soldiers of the Dominion, and they did not break easily. Expected a beaten garrison making its last stand. They had not expected this sudden volcanic eruption of fury centered on a bleeding cub who would not go down. 11 minutes. That is how long it took. 11 minutes from the moment Kale screamed to the moment the last Yadrathi soldier in the breach fell, and the gap was sealed with wreckage and weapons fire, and the sheer stubborn refusal of people who had decided, collectively and without discussion, that this was the line, and it would not move. Kale did not see the end of it. His body, which had carried him far beyond what biology should have allowed, finally presented the bill. The adrenaline drained out of him like water from a cracked vessel, and his legs gave out, and he collapsed beside Mara in the dust and rubble. She was conscious, barely. Her eyes were open and unfocused, and her left arm was trapped under concrete, but her right arm was free, and she used it now, reaching out with fingers that were bloody, and shaking, and pulling the cub against her chest. He was so light she could feel his ribs through his fur and his heart hammering, and the wet heat of his blood soaking into her uniform. "You stupid, brave, stupid, wonderful, stupid kid," she whispered, and there were tears on her face, which was not something Kale had ever seen before, and which frightened him more than anything the Yadrathi had done. "Clan stays," he said in Tohari, and his voice was barely a breath. "Clan stays." "Yeah," Mara said, holding him tighter. "Clan stays. The medics found them like that, tangled together in the rubble, the woman and the cub, both bleeding, both breathing, both alive in defiance of every reasonable expectation. Corporal Deng climbed down from the wall and walked to the breach, and stood over the place where Kale had made his stand. He looked at the 4 dead Idrathi soldiers, and the blood on the ground, and the claw marks in the concrete. Away on a stretcher. He was not an emotional man. He was a sniper, which meant he was paid to be calm and precise and detached. But his hands were shaking, and his eyes were wet. And when Torres came up beside him and said, "Did you see that?" Deng could only nod. "Yeah," he said, "I saw it." He paused. "The whole galaxy is going to see it." The relief fleet arrived 71 hours after the breach. 3 colonial warships and a carrier full of fresh troops dropped out of jump space and scattered the Idrathi fleet like a boot through a nest of insects. The Dominion forces, already stalled by a garrison that should have fallen on day 2, but had instead turned into a meat grinder, broke orbit and ran. The ground troops they left behind surrendered within hours. Ashfall had held. The cost was written on every wall and every face. 63 dead, 140 wounded. Buildings reduced to rubble, streets turned to craters. The southern wall a jagged ruin that looked like something had taken a bite out of it. But it had held. Kale woke up in a real hospital for the second time in his life. This one was aboard the carrier, a clean white room that hummed with the sound of machines keeping people alive. The air smelled like antiseptic and recycled oxygen, and nothing at all like dust or blood or burning. He tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Pain announced itself from at least 4 different locations on his body. The plasma burn across his ribs was the worst, a raw red line that the doctors had sealed with synthetic skin, but that still throbbed with every breath. The slash across his back was closed with neat stitches. His shoulder was wrapped in a compression bandage that restricted his movement, and his entire body felt like it had been dropped from a great height onto something hard, which was not far from the truth. "Do not move," said a voice to his left. Mara was sitting in a chair beside his bed. Her left arm was in a cast, and her face was bruised, and there was a bandage across her forehead. But she was upright and alert and alive, which was all that mattered. "How long?" Kale asked. 3 days. "You have been sleeping." 3 days, she replied. 3 days. He blinked. "The wall. It held. They came. The fleet came. We made." Kale let his head fall back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling, and let the information settle into him like rain into dry ground. They had made it. They were alive. The Idrathi were gone. He turned his head to look at Mara, and found that she was already looking at him with an expression he could not read. It was not sadness exactly, and not pride exactly. It was something bigger and more complicated, something that contained both of those things and a dozen others. "You are grounded," she said, "forever, permanently, until the heat death of the universe. You are never leaving a bunker again." "You say that," Kale said. "You not mean it?" "I absolutely mean it." "You not mean it?" She opened her mouth to argue. Then she closed it and smiled, a small, tired smile that cracked through the exhaustion on her face like sunlight through clouds. "No," she admitted, "I do not mean it." The weeks that followed were strange. Famous. The battle footage spread across the colonial networks, and then the independent channels, and then the broader galactic media, with the speed that only stories of defiance and survival can achieve. Military analysts discussed the garrison's tactics. Political commentators debated the implications for frontier defense policy. Journalists descended on the settlement like hungry birds. But the footage that spread fastest, the clip that burned across every network and every species mediasphere like wildfire, was not the final counterattack, or the wall holding, or the fleet arriving. It was 37 seconds of security camera footage from the southern breach. In it, a small gray figure with a bristling mane and bloody claws stood over a fallen human soldier. 4 Yggdrathi soldiers lay dead or dying around him. A fifth, an officer, stood before him with a weapon drawn. The cub was wounded and shaking, and so small against the rubble and the smoke and the scale of the destruction around him. And then the audio kicked in, and the cub opened his mouth and screamed words that every translator in the galaxy rendered slightly differently, but that all carried the same meaning. Not a single hair will drop from the human's head anymore. And then he leaped. The clip was viewed 9 billion times in its first week. Humans in particular reacted with the intensity that only humans bring to stories about small creatures protecting people they love. The phrase, "protect the cub," appeared on signs and shirts and social media profiles across 100 worlds. Donations to Tohari refugee organizations increased by 8,000% in a single month. Politicians, who had spent years ignoring the Tohari situation, suddenly found it very important to make speeches about solidarity and justice. Kale, who had no interest in politics and only a vague understanding of what the internet was, found the whole thing confusing. "Care now?" he asked Mara one evening. "Tohari suffer long time. Nobody care before." Mara was quiet for a moment. "Because now they saw it," she said. "Humans are strange that way. We can know something is wrong for years and do nothing. But when we see it, when it has a face and a voice and a name, something changes. We are not good at caring about numbers. We are very good at caring about people. That is stupid. Yes, but it help." On the 32nd day after the battle, 3 Tohari elders came to the hospital. Kale did not know them. They were from other refugee groups on other worlds, old survivors who carried the memories of what the Tohari had been before the fall. They wore traditional cloaks of woven firestrand, a material from the homeworld that was now almost impossibly rare, and their manes were braided in patterns that Kale recognized from his mother's stories. They stood at the foot of his bed and looked at him, with eyes that held 1,000 years of grief and something new, something that looked like dawn. The eldest, a female named Shava, whose white mane fell to her waist, spoke in formal Tohari that Kale could barely follow, because it used old words that his generation had never learned. "We have watched the recording," Shava said. "We have watched it many times. We have shared it with every Tohari we could reach, from the camps on Varath to the settlements on the rim worlds." She paused. "Do you know what you did, cub?" Kale shook his head. "You reminded us," Shava said, and her voice broke on the word in a way that made the other elders look away. "You reminded us of what we are. You stood as our ancestors stood, between death and those you love, and you did not move. The Dominion told us we were broken. They told us we were tame. They told us our fire was dead." She stepped forward and placed her hand on Kale's head, over his mane, in the gesture of an elder. "Blessing a warrior. You proved them wrong." The ceremony was small and private, and it was the most significant thing that had happened in Tohari culture in 30 years. The elders declared Kale the founder of a new clan. This was unprecedented. Among the Tohari, clans were ancient things, stretching back centuries, rooted in blood and territory and tradition. A new clan had not been established in living memory, and the idea that a cub, a child, could be named as its founder was so far outside convention that several of the elders had argued about it for days. But Shava was firm. "Convention died with the homeworld," she said. "If we cling to the old ways until there are no Tohari left to practice them, then we have failed ourselves more thoroughly than the Yggdrathi ever could. This cub has shown us a new way forward. We follow or we fade." The clan was named Velashara, which translated roughly to "those who stand between." Its first member, after Kale, was Mara. The elders performed the rite with careful solemnity, braiding a strand of fire strand into Mara's hair, while Kale pressed his forehead to her shoulder and spoke the words of bonding in the old tongue. She was named Clan Mother, a title that carried weight and responsibility and a level of respect that most Tohari spent their entire lives trying to earn. Mara, who did not cry easily and who had held herself together through bombardment and surgery and the death of friends, cried during the ceremony. Corporal Deng was offered membership the next day. He accepted with a salute and a nod, and said nothing else because he was Deng and that was his way. Torres joined too, with considerably more noise and enthusiasm. Several other garrison soldiers followed. A few Tohari refugees from Ashfall asked to be included. Vel Ashera grew. The ripples spread further than anyone expected. On the Tohari refugee worlds, something shifted. Battle of Ashfall passed from camp to camp, settlement to settlement, whispered around fires and shared on battered comm devices. It was not just a war story. It was a resurrection. A cub with nothing, bonded to an alien, standing against the Dominion and winning. Young Tohari began to straighten their backs. Elders began to teach the old combat forms again, the ones that had been forbidden and forgotten. Families that had been scattered began to reach out to each other, to reconnect, to rebuild the web of clan bonds that the Adrathi had spent a generation tearing apart. In the halls of galactic politics, pressure mounted. The Tohari situation, ignored for decades, was suddenly on every agenda. The footage of Kale's stand played in the background of debates and conferences and speeches, and no politician could look at it and then vote to continue doing nothing, nod and keep their seat anyway. Humans were like that. Once they decided to care, they were relentless about it. They organized and donated and lobbied and protested and wrote letters and made noise, so much noise, until the galaxy could not ignore them. Plans were drawn up for the liberation of Tohar Prime. Kale did not know about any of this. He sat on the rebuilt wall of Ashfall on a warm evening 6 weeks after the battle, his legs dangling over the edge, and watched the sun go down over the dust plains. The sky turned colors that did not have names in any language he knew. Red and gold and purple, and something in between that was the color of the inside of a fire. Mara sat beside him. Her cast was off, but she still moved her left arm carefully. Her hair, longer now than it had been when they met, was braided with a thin strand of fire strand that caught the light like a thread of captured flame. They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only exists between people who do not need words to know what the other is feeling. Months ago, he was growing fast, his body finally catching up now that he had food and safety and rest. His mane was thickening, coming in darker than before, and new scars crossed over old ones on his ribs and back and shoulder. He was still young, still a cub by any measure, but there was something in the set of his jaw and the steadiness of his eyes that was not young at all. Mara looked at him and saw the future. She saw the warrior he would become, and the leader and the symbol. She saw the clan growing around him, Tohari and human and maybe others too, a new thing in a galaxy that desperately needed new things. But mostly, she saw a kid who liked dried meat and hated baths and still curled up against her side when the nightmares came. "Kale," she said, "what do you want to be when you grow up?" He considered this with the seriousness that he gave to all important questions. He looked out at the horizon, where the sky met the dust, and the first stars were beginning to show, faint and distant and full of possibility. He thought about the valley and the fire and the cave. He thought about the drainage pipe and the fever and the boot that nudged his ribs. He thought about 2 plates on a table and a hand on his mane and the sound of someone saying, "I am coming back," and meaning it. He thought about the breach and the blood and the scream that came from somewhere so deep inside him that he had not known it existed until it tore itself free. He looked at Mara, and he grinned, a wide-fanged grin that showed every tooth in his head, and he said in common, with perfect clarity, "Loud." Mara laughed. It was a real laugh, full and warm, and startled out of her like a bird from a bush. It was the first real laugh she had let herself have in years, maybe since before Nairobi, maybe since before the world got heavy and sad and full of loss. It came from the same deep place that Kale's scream had come from, where pain and love live side by side. And sometimes, if you are very lucky, the love wins. She laughed until her eyes watered, and Kale laughed too, a rough barking sound that was more growl than giggle. And they sat there on the wall, with the sunset painting them gold and the stars coming out one by one. Below them, mounted on the gate of Ashfall, where the old colonial seal used to hang, a new banner flew in the evening wind. It was simple, just a piece of cloth that someone had painted by hand, but it was the most important flag on the planet. It showed a human hand and a Tohari claw, fingers and talons interlocked, gripping each other with the kind of strength that does not let go. Beneath the image, in both common and Tohari, a single word, ours. The wind caught the banner and it snapped and rippled against the darkening sky, and across the settlement, people looked up at it, humans and Tohari and others too, and they saw it, and they knew what it meant, that something new had been born in the fire and the dust and the blood of this small forgotten place on the edge of the galaxy. Something that the Yadrathi could not kill, and the politicians could not ignore, and the historians would argue about for centuries. It meant that a cub with nothing had found a clan in the most unlikely place, and then burned so bright defending it that the whole galaxy had to shield its eyes. It meant that the old ways were not the only ways, and that broken things could be reforged into shapes that the universe had never seen before. It meant family. And somewhere out in the dark, between the stars, in the corridors of Yadrathi warships and the halls of Dominion Command, officers who had reviewed the footage of the breach shared quiet, uneasy glances and said nothing, because they had heard the scream. And they knew, in the cold, scaled depths of their ancient hearts, that they had made a terrible mistake. Period.